So before we get started on a lot of these techniques, I want to go over just briefly some of the common techniques and tools that we'll be using. And in some of these lectures, I'm going to have the screen more zoomed out so that you can see more of the panels. Some of these lectures, I'll be more zoomed in like this, where we only need the layers panel and the tools panel. Now, if you look at the tools panel over here, you see this little arrow. If you click that, it'll make it one row. And I like to keep it one row usually because it gives me more room over here to work with. And in those lectures where I'm zoomed out more, then it will be one row. Where I'm zoomed in more, in order to actually fit on the screen, I'll have to have it be two rows like that. All right, same tools, it's just one is one row, one is two rows. Now, as far as our tools go up here, a lot of the top ones are selections. So if you click and hold, every tool that has arrow next to it means there's more options. So we'll use, the rectangular marquee tool not too often in these, but the elliptical marquee tool we will use when we need to select, say, the eyes or the lips and we want to do some kind of effect. The lasso tool is pretty useful when you just need to make a rough selection around an area before you add an effect. The polygonal lasso tool is better for straight lines unless you click very often to create a curve. One of the most commonly used selection tools is the quick selection tool. So that is if you just need to click and drag, and Photoshop tries to figure out where the edge should be, and we can use all these selection tools in conjunction with each other. You just hold shift to add to a selection. So if I click, double click, then that added to the selection. If you hold Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac, then that will subtract from a selection. All right, you can use those together. If you want to deselect, you can go to Control or Command D, or you can use, say, one of these marquee selection tools, just click anywhere. The Move tool, that's if you just want to move. Obviously, it won't move this background layer because it's just one layer so far. It's locked. If I press Control or Command J, then I have a new layer that's duplicated, and I can click and drag and move that around. All right. The crop tool we will use when we want to just improve the composition of a photo. If you click and drag, we can crop out certain areas. You can make a preset crop up here if you wanted to. If you want it to be 100 pixels, you'd type in 100px by 100px. And if you want it to be 72 pixels per inch for, say, a website, or if you had 300 pixels per inch, 150 pixels per inch, whatever you had, then you could preset it there, and then it would constrain to those proportions as you clicked and dragged it. If you want to add to the canvas with the crop tool, you can actually click and drag outside of the original area, then it will add to that image. And then we have some more area over there to work with. Alternatively, you could go to Image, Canvas Size, and set this to pixels, and if you click here and change the width up more, then it would add area to that image without stretching the image. It would just add area to the canvas. If you go to image size, while we're on that, you can change the width and the height, and if this is checked, then they will stay proportionate. So if you change width, it will change the height with the same ratio of width to height. And if you change the resolution, obviously if we're printing, it's going to need to be a higher number. If it's for the web, it can be a little bit lower, like 72, or a lot of people even use that for printing. It depends on the printer, but a lot of times they'll need at least 150 ppi. 300 is good. You're just going to lose a little bit of detail if you have a really low number. On the toolbar, the eyedropper tool, we might use a little bit just to pull a sample of color from a portrait. And we have the foreground color selected there, so that's changing the foreground color. If we have the background color selected, if we clicked it and then click somewhere in here, then it'll change the background color. These over here, the spot healing brush tool, the healing brush tool, patch tool, we're going to use that a lot when we go over the retouching techniques. So the spot healing brush tool, if you just click and drag somewhere, it's going to kind of remove whatever the content is there, whether it's a blemish or a freckle or a smile line or whatever, and it's going to look at the pixels around it. If you use healing brush tool, we need to alt click somewhere first to set a source area, and then you click and drag, and it kind of brings those pixels over a little bit, but it still does mix it in a little bit, especially compared to, say, the clone stamp tool, which just brings the pixels over. The patch tool, if you just click and drag somewhere and drag over, we're going to use that with some of the retouching techniques where you want to take a patch of skin and just bring it over to replace another area. Whenever we're doing these techniques, if you immediately go to edit and then fade, so for this one to be fade patch selection, then you can really fade the effect that we just did. So on this one, it'll fade the opacity of it. All right, just something to consider. We will be using the brush tool a lot, not really the pencil tool and some of these other things, but the brush tool we'll be using when we want to mask out certain areas. So if I had a layer here and I wanted to mask out so that it would erase basically to the layer below it, we'd add a layer mask at the bottom of the layers panel and we would paint black in. All right, so then you can kind of see, you start to see the layer below it, because the layer below it is just slightly lower than the one above, so you can see there. All right, so here's the two layers. Now you notice when I was painting there, up at the top, we have opacity set to 45%. That's why it's partially transparent. This is the options panel up here. We always need the tools open, the options open, and often the layers open. So if any of these you don't see them, just go to window, and then options and tools are right there, and layers is right there. The options just give us the options for every tool that we have selected. So another thing we'll be using in a few of the techniques is clone stamp tool. Instead of just using an algorithm to try to blend in an area, the clone stamp tool, we can still have a soft edge to it, hardness set to 0%. Whenever we want to adjust the softness, we click up here. With this one, and I'm clicking left and right bracket on the keyboard to resize the brush. Any tool that uses the brush, we can do that. But the clone stamp tool is basically if I Alt or Option click somewhere and then click somewhere else, it's going to pull from wherever that source area is. All right, so we'll use that when we want to remove certain areas and cover them up with pixels from another area. We won't use eraser really because I prefer to mask. It's a lot better because it's non-destructive erasing. As far as the dodge and burn tools, these are from the old school darkroom. So in our digital darkroom, we could use the burn tool to make an area darker, so it darkens the dark areas. And then if you use the dodge tool, it makes the lighter areas lighter. A better way, or I think a way that's a lot more customizable, is to add a new duplicated layer and then change the blending mode, which we'll be using. I'll talk about that in a second. So over here, we'll also be using maybe the hand tool if you just want to move around the canvas. And then to zoom in, this is the magnifying glass. If you just click and drag, you can move in. If you have scrubby zoom checked, click and drag and move in. If you don't have it checked, then you just select an area and it'll zoom in. You can also, and I prefer just to use Control minus and Control plus on the PC, or Command minus or Command plus on the Mac. It's a lot quicker if we're just having another tool selected instead of having to select the magnifying glass tool. Now down at the bottom of the tool panel, you'll see this is the foreground color, this is the background color. If we ever want to fill a layer with the foreground color, we can press Alt backspace or Option delete on the Mac, Alt backspace on the PC. If we want to fill an area with whatever the current background color is, we can do Control backspace or Command delete on the Mac. So that's the basics of the tools that we'll be using. Over here on the layers panel, if we ever want to duplicate a layer, and sometimes we're going to be creating a selection first and then duplicating, we just press Control on the PC or Command on the Mac and then J, and that just duplicates whatever we had select. If we didn't have anything selected, it would just duplicate the entire layer. And whatever layers on top obviously is going to cover up the layers below it. Now, over here on blending modes, we're going to use multiply to darken, we're going to use screen or lighten to lighten an area, and then when you have some hues that we want to cover and just overlay on top of the area below it, we'll use overlay, and we're also going to use soft light a little bit. And on all these, we will be adjusting the opacity, and sometimes we will be adding a layer mask to selectively mask out areas of the layer. Now up at the top, obviously whenever we want to save, if you want to save some of these throughout the lectures, you can go to File, Save As, and when you do, just set this to PSD, Photoshop, and then it will save all the layer information with it. If you save it as JPEG, it will flatten the file. And then up here at the top, if you go to Edit Undo, it'll undo what you just did. If you go to Edit Step Backward, you can keep going to that, and it will keep stepping backward. It's like undo. It just keeps going back more steps. You can also go to Window and then History, and you can go back to a certain state of your document that you want to. It'll go back. If you go to Image and Adjustments, there's a lot of image adjustments here that we'll be doing. For example, hue saturation, color balance, black and white. We'll be using levels adjustments, curves adjustments. A lot of these are also down here, and I prefer to do the adjustment layers instead, because then the effect is still live. It's on its own layer, and we can adjust the opacity of it, and we can still adjust it. So if you went to curves and then did some kind of curves adjustment, then you can still double click on it here and still adjust it after the fact. And we can also, it comes with a mask, so we can mask out certain parts of that adjustment layer. And if we ever need to, I already went over how to duplicate a layer, but let's say we wanted to take all these layers together and merge them and then copy them onto a new layer on top. All we would have to do is hold down Control-Alt-Shift on the PC or Command-Option-Shift on the Mac, and then press E while you're holding those. And what that does, as you can see, is it took all these layers as if we merged them. And if we wanted to just merge them, we could do Control-E. But as long as we add those other keys, it will merge them into this top layer here, which is a merged version of all the layers below it. So that's best practices, because in case we need to keep our original layers, keep those options there in case we want to go back and adjust those effects after the fact, but we want to work on a duplicated layer for now and add some more effects. There are a couple more shortcuts in this section in a PDF handout that is pretty handy just to print out. And also, I suggest checking out my free course called Getting Started in Photoshop if you have never used Photoshop before. It can be helpful going over some more of the basics, but I just wanted to go over some of the tools and just give a summary of them, how the layers panel works, and some of the common effects we're going to be using in these portrait photo Photoshop techniques.